Their words many maniapoto have been waiting more than a century to hear.
The Crown delivers this long overdue apology.
Ngāti Maniapoto's settlement and apology is one of 80 treaty settlements made with hapū and iwi since 1989, involving the transfer of more than $2.7 billion of redress.
Marking an end to more than 30 years of negotiations for the King Country iwi.
In apologising, the Crown takes responsibility for the pain and hurt it has caused and makes commitments to you which it will uphold.
But many of those commitments, and they are legal commitments, have not been delivered.
We've found ourselves delayed, we've found ourselves having to explain, we've found ourselves having to actually, in some respects, actually spend money on trying to convince Crown agencies of what's right.
The word settlement often makes people think done and dusted, you know?
Exactly.
But actually these things are massively complicated to implement often. They span a number of years. And they're also about resetting a relationship. And I think getting both of those right is really important.
But public agencies are not getting it right. We're talking about 150 organisations, from councils to state-owned enterprises to government departments. Their failure to do their jobs properly could lead to more costly legal action. It's all in a damning report from the Office of the Auditor General, John Ryan, on how public organisations are fulfilling or failing to fulfil treaty settlements.
It's significant financially, it's significant constitutionally, and it's a big accountability question for the public sector to deliver against its legal commitments. And it's about resetting relationships with iwi hapū, and I think for all those reasons, it's probably one of the most significant reports of my term.
I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Today on The Detail, what happens after the settlement is done and dusted, and why iwi and hapū aren't getting what they're legally entitled to.
There are multiple issues, and multiple iwi are dealing with these issues, but they're basically going from settlement and signing the deed of settlement to having to navigate a whole other web of really complex issues.
More from Taiha Molyneux, RNZ's Māori news editor, soon. But here are the numbers. Today, the 150 public organisations have about 12,000 individual contractual and legal commitments under about 80 settlements with about 70 groups. Every one of the public organisations that were audited had difficulties meeting some of those commitments. Every one. Here's John Ryan.
Yeah, I think that public organisations have got, on some cases, many thousands of commitments to deliver. They really hadn't put enough time into understanding what those commitments were, the complexity of those commitments, the need to work across the public sector to deliver on some of those commitments, but also to actually deliver the redress that was agreed at the time Parliament entered the settlement. So yes, I think that the public sector probably, this hadn't been highlighted enough, and I think our report now brings that out into the open.
I want to talk a little bit more about that soon, but I really want to know what happens after a treaty settlement is signed. Can we talk about the modern treaty settlement process?
Yeah, so there is a deed of settlement, and then legislation is usually passed to support that deed of settlement. That includes an apology, it includes redress for the wrongs that had been done. And that legislation is typically passed unanimously in Parliament, so all parties support settlements when in Parliament. The settlement's quite specific. It sets out the redress that is expected for that settlement. So that would include financial payments, it might include commercial settlements, it might include properties, right of first refusal on properties, deferred settlements, name changes potentially, or new agreements of working collectively with iwi that had settled. So quite comprehensive, and that is all set out very clearly in the settlement process. That then passes to typically a number of public sector agencies to deliver against. And that's really the part that we've looked at. The commitments are made, they are passed into law, these are legal commitments, much like your tax commitments. These have to be delivered. And we wanted to know how well the public sector was delivering against those.
And are there deadlines?
For some things there are deadlines. So, for example, some bits of redress are quite complex, like Crown Forest licensed land can be quite complex to transfer, and that's given time, though, and the settlement, so 5 years for the transfer of that. And one of the things we highlight in the report is that quite a few of those were not transferred in the 5-year settlement period. So, yes, there are deadlines for things. Other things are more open-ended. For example, relationship agreements will have an ongoing commitment. I think that's the other point I wanted to raise. Often the word settlement sounds like a property transaction or something where you do the deal and then both sides kind of move on. These settlements are much deeper than that. There is redress, there are compensation payments and other things that need to be made. But they are also there to set up a new relationship between iwi, hapū and the Crown. And I think in the context of what we've seen, not delivering on the more specific parts of the settlement do put questions as to whether the Crown is actually entering into a new relationship with iwi and hapū who have settled.
When you say relationship, what do you mean by that? Are you talking about co-governance or co-management of things like the Waikato River?
So they can be specific, set out. There could be specific co-governance arrangements that set out. But there's also an expectation in the settlement that a new relationship is formed, and it doesn't have to be co-governance. That could be so simple as agencies working together to make sure they deliver on the commitments in the treaty settlement. So simple things like that, where these are small agencies, post-settlement governance entities, the iwi hapū representatives are often quite small, and they're working with multiple agencies to do their settlements and to get that redress paid across. And what happens, of course, is that agencies work on their own in doing that, but they don't work necessarily collectively, and that's one of the points we make, that you've got small settlement entities trying to work across government. And so to start a new relationship, one of the points we make is actually working collectively within the public sector to deliver on those commitments so that the groups actually get a collective view of their redress and the progress of it. The types of things we've seen and pointed out in our report is that the government may have committed to relationship agreements and those are not being put in place, to letters of introduction which are not put in place. But probably the more significant ones we talk to are things like rights of first refusal on particular properties where either they were not put in place and they should have been. Some properties we saw had been sold even though they should have had a right of first refusal on them given to iwi. We saw missing and on the wrong titles as well. So we saw quite a lot of issues in the rights of first refusal. We also saw Crown Forest licensed land not being transferred within the time frame that was given, which was 5 years. And the 5 years was given because it was meant to be time to deal with any complexity of issues. But what we saw there was the public sector starting late on that process and therefore not meeting the 5-year windows.
So in Ngāti Toa's settlement, we had property rights that included rights of first refusal on properties that the Crown no longer wants, and we have deferred selection property rights, which are basically the right to compulsorily acquire Crown lands, but then we have to lease them back to the Crown.
This is Helmut Modlik, Chief Executive of Te Runanga o Ngāti Toa Rangatira, talking to Radio Wātea's Dale husband about the audit and the settlement process for his iwi.
Now, in both of those cases, as we've looked to action them, we've found ourselves delayed as the agencies in question who hold those lands have had to get up to speed with what their obligations are. They've had to resource it. And in our case, it ended up costing us millions of dollars in costs associated with executing on those deferred selection property rights. Now, there will be other issues, specific issues that each iwi around the motu as they're engaging, whether it's with conservation, whether it's with education, doesn't matter which agency, they'll be finding similar sorts of limited readiness in those agencies.
Why is this happening? Why aren't these issues being addressed? Why aren't these public organisations doing what they're supposed to be doing?
I think there's a range of recommendations we make, and I think they point to some of the reasons that we saw. First, there's a lot of commitments. There's 12,000 individual commitments, but when they look at joint agencies, there's up to something like 18,000 commitments to be managed. We saw agencies had not put enough effort into understanding those commitments early enough. We saw some not understanding they had commitments earlier on. We also saw issues where the significance and the complexity of delivering on those commitments wasn't understood. And all of that points to, I think, a lack of attention inside some agencies to these commitments, these legal requirements on them, a lack of reporting publicly and to ministers on where they were at, and I guess overall a system that was not highlighting this as a matter that needed to be addressed. So we point to a range of things that need to change. Certainly agency levels, they really need to get on top of understanding their commitments and governing them well, understanding the status, understanding issues and resolving those as quickly as they can. At a system level, we see that chief executives could be better supported. There is some support now in place with new frameworks that have been developed in recent years. But, this is a big part of some agencies' work, and they need to be able to work with post-settlement governance entities to understand the intent behind settlements and to deliver on those.
And so just going back to why this is happening, is it that people don't care enough? Is it that the systems, there's not good leadership on this, it's too complicated? What is it?
Look, I think that what I conclude in the report is that we've allowed non-delivery against legal commitments to continue for too long. And what needs to happen is a range of changes to make that more effective and to deliver on those commitments that have been made through settlements. That's at an agency level. They really need to get a grip of what they've got to deliver, how they're going to deliver it, work with other agencies where required. But it's also at a system level. There's more support needed for resolving issues that might arise, more development and training and support for chief executives who are responsible for many thousands of commitments in some agencies. And then ultimately for all of us to be clear on where these settlements are at. These are meant to be durable settlements, and if we don't deliver on the redress that's been agreed, then there's a risk that they will not be.
I just wonder if it's, at a time when there are huge cuts to the public service, if this is really going to be sorted, because it sounds like, I don't know, are these public organisations overwhelmed?
So the report, the timeframe for our report was during the last 18 months, but look back many years, and these issues have arisen over many years. So I don't think we can connect that to any changes to the size or shape of the public sector. These are legal commitments. In terms of priorities, agencies, all public agencies, should actually prioritise delivering on their legal commitments. So I think regardless of the point in the economic cycle, the public, post-settlement governance entities, iwi, hapū, should expect the public sector to deliver on legal requirements.
Taiha Molyneux has done story after story about treaty settlements and their difficulties.
In regard to the post-settlement governance entities and the settlement process and all that kind of thing, people tend to think that once the settlement is sorted and the signing takes place and the deed of settlement is organised, that it ends there. But essentially it shifts iwi from one phase of navigating a system that wasn't created or designed by them to another phase of navigating a whole other series of processes, policies, acts and that kind of thing to sort of start progressing forward.
What kind of things do you hear about in terms of failure to meet the settlement?
There's multiple things that people talk about in terms of failure, but a lot of it can tend to sort of stem from the leadership of public organisations, of ministries, of government organisations. The majority of the leadership are non-Māori, and the majority of that leadership don't have any specific KPIs or responsibilities that align to delivering or meeting the requirements of a treaty settlement. So with the repeal of Section 7AA, that was one specific area that iwi were really pushing on. If there was a specific legal requirement placed on the CEO to report annually, publicly and transparently about what they were doing to protect and preserve the culture of tamariki Māori within their care. So, another similar one would be Waikato Tainui taking the government to the High Court over pulling back on the use of te reo Māori within the public sector. The iwi was promised within their settlement in 1995 that the Crown would do everything it could to preserve and protect te reo. So there are a lot of different obligations that public organisations and ministries have, and there's not a lot of cross-communication within those ministries. So they tend to see their responsibilities as individual ones as opposed to a collective or taking a holistic approach to it, which is how Māori tend to operate. They operate in a collective approach, and there's a lot of talking, there's a lot of engagement, whereas these organisations tend to operate in silos.
And do they get any kind of support within government? Is there one group or one person that tries to work with them on navigating all these different areas?
I'm not 100% certain about what types of resources are assigned to post-settlement governance entities, but I can safely say that whatever resource is assigned, whether it be monetary or otherwise, there won't be enough there to support the level of engagement and the level of education that's required across those organisations to fully understand and comprehend the importance of meeting these treaty settlements. So essentially, we are having to go from explaining to the Crown how they have been impacted by the historical issues to do with colonisation, and then they're essentially turning into educators and trying to help these organisations understand this is why this requirement is important. There tends to be a lot of unwillingness to relinquish that power, can often be quite a problem, which has popped up with a lot of iwi. A recent one would be the Te Ohu Kaimoana case. That's very complex. I won't get into the detail of that, but that's essentially payments that have not been made that were part of a treaty settlement that had to go all the way to the High Court. So we are having to go from one system into another system and work their way through trying to get what is promised within their treaty settlements, which sometimes change. So it's a very, very, I suppose it's a web that needs some very specific and very targeted navigation, and not necessarily on the Māori side, more on the public organisation side.
Within iwi and hapū, there are obviously experts, aren't there, and people who understand the legalese and the complexities of this. Are they not able to do the job completely?
I think they're able to do the job completely, but the time it takes, the amount of effort and resource they have to meet those demands, whereas a ministry or a department, a government department, would have a whole department at some stages dedicated to working on things like this, whereas an iwi will have maybe one or two people that can do it. And it's similar with communication, so sort of being able to get all the kōrero and get all the information out to all the people that are, involved in the claimant group can be a really tricky process. And in terms of reporting on it, a lot of the iwi are actually on the ground doing the work, and they don't have the resource or the funding to get a big communications campaign behind them and help support them communicate with iwi. So it's across a range of things, but from the perspective of someone that's done a lot of stories, the confusion or the issues tend to pop up when it gets to the higher levels of management within those organisations who don't understand and don't have a legal responsibility to meet those requirements. A lot of them, in the past, I've spoken to some CEs of organisations and they've said, well, we're not a treaty partner. That's not our responsibility. But they are subject to the treaty partner who are the Crown. So there's a lot of, I wouldn't necessarily say ambiguity, but there is a lot of ignorance in terms of understanding what those treaty settlements involve and why it's so important to work holistically and work in a collective space and speak to each other. And that doesn't tend to happen within a lot of public organisations.
The report says failure to provide redress has created a risk of legal action against the public sector and the government. John Ryan says it has already been very costly.
We mention in the report that information we received from Te Arawhiti talked of tens of millions that has been paid to either, address settlements that could not be progressed or not delivered. So yes, there has been some compensations paid already. I think the bigger question, besides the money question, which is important enough, is that these are intending to set out new relationships. And if you can't deliver on the basics of redress, then that will undermine the future of a new relationship. So I think the most important thing is that agencies get on top of their commitments and they deliver them. And I think that will form a basis for moving forward.
There isn't really any room to wriggle in terms of doubting or questioning what the Auditor General's report is saying. It is factual, it is accurate, and so now really it comes down to a response. And hopefully it's a respectful and appropriately substantive response from the government. We're not looking to just point fingers. We've got some understanding about how big a job it is, how complex it is, and we're putting our hand up and saying, look, we're happy to work with you as our partners in resolving these important issues.
Firstly, we share a draft of our report with the agencies that we audited. They have been supportive in broad terms of the findings in the report and of the recommendations. So we will go back in 12 months or so's time to look at how well they've progressed those recommendations. And I've also seen media commentary from some of the post-settlement governance entities about the report and its findings, and I think to some extent it validates some of the concerns they've been expressing over a number of years.
What do you expect to see in 12 months' time?
At an agency level, I would really expect them to be completely over their commitments. They should know the status of them, they should know the significance of them, and they should know how they're going to progress them. So I think at an individual agency level, I would expect a very strong level of oversight and governance to be in place. I think I would like to see, in particular, Land Information New Zealand being much more robust in the way it applies rights of first refusal, so that the memorials on titles are comprehensive and accurate. And I think that's a key recommendation which will underpin many aspects of settlements. And then from a system point of view, I'd like to see that they've thought through how they will support all treaty settlement commitments across the broader public sector and support chief executives more to do what they're responsible for in delivering against those settlements.
If you don't see that in 12 months' time, what's the next step?
Well, as you may know, my role is I can't enforce actions from the public sector in general terms, but I would issue a report. I would talk to the select committee that would be reviewing that report, and I'd expect that they would have some concerns if progress hadn't been made. The call to action in our report, I think, is pretty clear that actually the public sector needs to step up in both its understanding and its delivery of commitments in treaty settlements. There hasn't been enough attention to this over many, many years and many different governments. These are legal requirements. They are accountability questions for the public sector. We need to honour our legal commitments. That's the bottom line.
So what now, Taiha? I mean, this report has come out. John Ryan says it's probably one of the most significant pieces of work that he has done in his time as Auditor General. What do iwi and hapū want now?
I think iwi and hapū just want what they've always wanted, is just to have their treaty settlements honoured and not have to jump through a whole other set of hoops in terms of the bureaucracy, the systemic frameworks, I suppose, because once you're out of the settlement process, you have to establish an entity that's mandated by the government, and the roles and responsibilities, the rules of it, and the Crown is what sets the adequate responsibilities that they have. So it could be going back to the beginning and starting a whole new entity, but within each iwi and within each hapū, there are a series of issues that they need to address. And the problem with that is that they're having to navigate this on top of everything else they're trying to sort out for their people. So it's almost like you think about Atlas carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. That's what every iwi has to deal with in terms of the settlement process. They've got to keep carrying that load.
How much confidence is there that things will be different?
I think it'd be safe to say there's very little confidence that things will be, I suppose, addressed adequately. And obviously every government has tried to address it in some way, shape or form, and it's never necessarily been the way to fix it. But so I could be wrong, but from those I've spoken to and from the stories we've engaged in from last year with the hikoi, the Toitū Te Tiriti movement, is they've actually taken up a process of educating Māori as to how to be a part of the submissions process. So they had online workshops and that kind of thing. So you've got a younger generation of people who understand how to use these different tools, and they're actually reaching a lot more people. People in Australia, people that don't necessarily normally engage with those processes, are becoming more aware. So in terms of the iwi or the Māori in general side, there is a much more powerful, stronger voice coming up, because there's these young ones that come through the kōhanga that are confident in te ao Māori and confident in te ao Pākehā, that are using these tools to sort of reach more people. So that's definitely something I haven't seen on this magnitude before.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. Gwen McClure produced this podcast and Jeremy Ansell engineered it. Thanks to Taiha Molineux and John Ryan. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Mā te wā.